Let me. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a discussion about homelessness in Lubbock. We have a very knowledgeable panel today, and we hope the next hour and a half are informative. The panel will discuss past policies and past actions that have shaped this community, the current outlook when it comes to people experiencing homelessness, and suggestions as we move forward. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's discussion was organized and set up by Open Door, but the opinions and views expressed this evening don't necessarily represent the views of Open Door. This is just a general discussion about homelessness. Also, there's a reason this panel is taking place today. December 16th, which is today, marks the 10-year anniversary of the City Council's vote to implement a curfew in select areas in the city, most significantly the downtown Mahon Library. We'll be discussing the impact of this vote, I am sure. My name is Matt Dotray, a reporter at the Lubbock Avalanche-Journal, and I'm playing the role of host for tonight's discussion, and I'll introduce everyone. Dr. Nicholas Bergfeld is an independent policy advisor with a focus on inclusion and government accountability in West Texas. Adam Pirtle is the advocacy co-director with Texas Housers. He works with low-income communities across Texas to ensure they have access to fair and decent housing, good schools and services in the ears of policymakers. Partnering with other community activists and attorneys, he researches the past and present socioeconomic conditions of low-income Texans to pursue fairer community planning policy that through community engagement and litigation. Quinn Paschal is an Open Door board member with 23 years of lived experience in homelessness. Today, he is a participant in Open Door housing and has lived in his own apartment since 2016. Andrea Omojola is the Chief Operating Officer of Open Door, where she oversees all programs and staff. She also serves on the board of the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care, which helps determine homeless policy direction in 215 Texas counties. Jim Beck is the founder of Open Door, formerly known as Carpenter's Church, in 1997, and led the church and organization through 2011. Today, he is an assistant professor of missions at Lubbock Christian University. And last but not least is Chad Wheeler, who is the chief executive officer at Open Door, where he has worked since 2007. He has previously served as the president of the South Plains Homelessness Committee, on the City of Lubbock Community Development Advisory Board, and on the board of the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. He is also the author of the recently published chapter on homelessness in the Lubbock Disparity Report. It's nice to see you all. A few more announcements. We are taking questions. If you would like to submit them, you can send us questions on the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments, and I'll be monitoring those both, and I'll kind of work those in as I ask questions. Just to mention one more time, there will be a lot of discussion surrounding the most recent version of the Lubbock Disparity Report, which I encourage you all to read. Dr. Bergfeld was the lead author of the Disparity Report, and in the updated version, Chad Wheeler wrote a section 7 about homelessness. And that's enough for me. Chad, do you want to introduce that report and what message you were kind of trying to get across in that report?
Sure, thanks, Matt, and welcome everybody. We are Facebook Live now, so we got that working. That's great. If you have comments, you can add them on Facebook or here. We'll try to respond to them in a bit. So the Lubbock Disparity Report, which Nick pioneered for us here this year, has a lot of different topics that have been added in this second version. And one of those is homelessness. And Nick and I have known each other for several years. And he reached out and said, hey, we want to, talk about disparity in terms of people experiencing homelessness as well. And, let's write where we've been and what's going on and what we need to do to improve things. And it was a really fun project for me. I mean, I've been working with people in homelessness in Lubbock since I moved here in 2005. And a lot of this stuff, I've experienced firsthand I was at those city council meetings and had conversations with multiple mayors now about homelessness over the years. And, but I learned a lot in the process. I read a lot of old documents from HUD and things from the 90s that people worked on that, I don't even know who they are. But they were doing some of that early work, trying to understand what homelessness looked like in Lubbock. And then kind of just put it together and tried to create as comprehensive a picture as I could of what things look like now and what things have been done in our community to try to, address the issues. So, it's been a really fun project, and I think it's really just a conversation starter for what we can do moving forward.
Dr. Bergfeld, do you want to talk about the disparity report as a whole and kind of the feedback you've gotten from it so far?
Yeah, sure. And so this new version, and I'm very thankful for Chad being able to participate and to write what I consider to be the definitive text on homelessness, policy and the history of that in the city of Lubbock today. Really what the document strives to be is a foundation for conversations, to show where as a community we've been, where we currently are, and when there are clear best practices, recommendations for how we can move forward together. And the homelessness section specifically, I think, really encapsulates all of those things, both in creating a comprehensive history of the challenges that Lubbock has historically faced when it comes to dealing with the issue of homelessness. And what you find as we kind of go through that, and as I think probably in this discussion we'll have, is just how the city has tried, sort of almost every way under the sun to kind of sweep this under the rug, to look at this through as many different mitigation strategies as possible versus actual interventions. And what you essentially need is to be able to create a language, a shared basis of information where all of us can essentially say, well, this is the conversation that we're having. This is what hasn't worked in the past. This is what we know can work in the future. Now, can we begin that conversation as a community to make sure that we're making informed decisions about these very important policies that impact, influence, and potentially shape the futures of some of the most vulnerable populations in the city of Lubbock. And so, when Chad became willing to write this, it was a no-brainer for me. I was so excited and thankful and grateful for his contributions to this because it's essentially something that we need to see across all disparities in the city of Lubbock. A challenge that we've had is the inability to put together documentation and data in a comprehensive way for these conversations to develop. And what Chad has done, I think to me, is really the prototype for what we hope to achieve when highlighting and discussing other disparities going forward.
Very good. So I think we are kind of going to break this discussion up into like where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. So Jim, do you kind of want to talk about the history and kind of help us understand how, it seems like in the early 2000s was when the city, kind of tried to address homelessness. Can you kind of talk about what led to that and kind of, what was happening leading up to that? And I know that's a broad question. Jim, you may be muted.
Don't do that. So.
There you go. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, in 1997, we began Carpenter's Church, which has now become Open Door. And so it was a grassroots ministry based upon a primary philosophy that true change comes through solidarity, not simply charity. That charity, which is food banks, clothing closets, those kinds of things, if we only focus on charity, it will actually sometimes hinder true change and it will create this dependency, but solidarity with is the path towards change. So Carpenter's Church was born on the foundation of relationship with the homeless. And so Quinn, being part of that long history, was one of the early people that were experiencing homelessness at the time that I got to know. In 2000, you mentioned 1999, there became these conversations, and a large part there, Quinn might be able to answer this better, but it seemed like the homeless context wasn't as exaggerated then as it is now, partly because people were doubling up, tripling up in different houses, sometimes many in North Overton, or in cars and driveways, or in sheds behind houses. There was a lot of that. And so but the collective point to some degree was North Overton, which was unkindly referred to as Tech Ghetto. And in 2000, of course, the McDougal companies, through the process of gentrification, come in and have this great idea to just basically raise all of North Overton, displacing almost 5,000 people. Actually, I think it was probably more than 5,000 people. It was the largest human displacement in American history by a private company. Well, when that happened, a lot of the people that were situated there didn't have housing because they were there because it was affordable housing, slumlords primarily. They were dispersed, which is one of the processes that I think we see. This forced migration is what I refer to it as. That one of the city's answers to homelessness is just forced migration. Move them out of downtown in North Overton, scatter them. Well, they scattered, and many of them ended up at Mahon Library. And because Mahon Library had awnings, so it was protected from shelter, had lights, it had plenty of room, and so community could be there. And so when this became the problem then in 2010, we have another process of forced migration, which comes through ordinances and laws and enforcing the laws that are on the books. And forced migration, I think Chad even brings this up, seem to be two of the city's answers always. Let's uphold the laws that are on the books and chase these people away. And so that's what took place, which, by the way, I think it's interesting because each of those processes in 2000, 2010 increased homelessness. It did not diminish homelessness. It made it worse. And even now, there is some conversation about forced migration once again, because that's the only thing that the city has in mind. In fact, I will say this. I was told by a former mayor many, many years ago that the answer to homelessness is to put them on a bus and send them to Amarillo. But as Chad recognizes, most of the people that are homeless in Lubbock are homeless in Lubbock because they're from Lubbock and this is home. And they don't want to go to Amarillo. They want to stay in Lubbock. And so, but it is this process, this history of ongoing forced migration, rather than finding solidarity with people and seeking ways to address poverty beyond just the physical, beyond charity, to solidarity and true structural change for the sake of the least among us in Lubbock. I hope that answered it in a nutshell.
It did, thank you. And I'll just, I'll refresh everyone. So quoting from the AJ in 2010, it says, the ordinance made it a misdemeanor offense to be on the grounds of the Mahon Library, the Memorial Civic Center, City Hall, and Lubbock Business Center between midnight and 5 a.m. City officials hope the curfew will further discourage homeless residents from sheltering around the Mahon Library, where patrons and employees have complained. A citation includes an up to $500 fine. Opponents argued the city has too few options available to demand the residents move somewhere else. Quinn, do you kind of want to talk about the situation in 2010 and kind of how it impacted you and then, you know, people downtown?
Well, there's a lot of us staying at the library at the time. Can you hear?
I can, yes, sir.
And there's a bunch of us stayed there, and you know, there's a safe place because when you get a bunch of people that know each other real well, and you know, kind of feel protected, you know, watching over each other, and when they moved us away from the library, everybody just scattered different places. And I went out there by McKenzie Park, way by where the meat factory used to be, and I stayed out there in the tent and the weeds and all, and stayed with friends. And I don't know where everybody else was different places like that too. You know, but I didn't. I mean, there's a lot of people that was on the streets back then. I mean, quite a bit. There's more now, different situations. But I was on the streets because I liked it. You know, I've been there so long, and I've traveled a lot of places around the United States and learned a lot of things. So, but Lubbock, I was born here, and I got Jim Beck, Chad, and a whole bunch of people. Rusty lad at that time, a lot of friends that I had, and still got friends that helped me out and what I've been through, and I'm just progressing, you know, because I want to progress and make myself a lot better.
You know, so when the city said they were not going to let you sleep in certain areas downtown, kind of, I mean, what was the next? I mean, what? Because that's not really a solution. I think that's kind of the point of this discussion, is that this wasn't really a solution. So where did you go from there? Kind of what was your mindset, and you know, what did people do?
Well, wherever they could lay their head, wherever they could find a place. You know, like me, I went out to McKenzie Park out there on 19th out there in the weeded area and put up a tent out there, and I stayed with friends. And I mean, it just depends on wherever. I don't know where they all went, but I mean, they just were scattered everywhere else. You know, you could see them easy. If they wasn't like me, I was always hid.
Yeah, Matt, if I may add to that, yeah,
Please.
The picture that's on the screen right now, there was a piece of city land, one or two, and the picture of Chad and I think Quinn looking at the map. Yeah, that one. We recognized that there was that small piece of land, you know, at what was it, Chad? 38. What was the address? Yeah, there it is. Broadway
Avenue Q.
Yeah, that little park right there was not under the ordinance. And so that was what initiated us to say, okay, then let's get some tents and let's put them up. And we had some advocates with us that were helping us think through this. And it was, in a sense, just let's force the hand of Lubbock. Because they never, one of our arguments the whole time was, where are they supposed to go?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what are they supposed to do if they can't stay here? And so that was how the tent city was born. And you know, with a bunch of tents popping up on Q and Broadway, it didn't take long before the city woke up and said, okay, wait, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then that was part of the beginning, I think, where Chad and I and several others began to learn. You know, at the time, that was one of the better practices, but over time, Chad has certainly learned a lot more. And so,
you know, and I think that's a great example of how we've been so reactionary to things. We kind of wait for things to get really, really bad. We say that's not our problem, or that's somebody else's problem. It gets really, really bad, and then we're like, okay, let's do something about it. And when we do, it's not always like long-term solutions. We've got a very short attention span in addressing homelessness in our community, like many communities. And we just want the quickest, easiest, out of the way solution. And so, you know, when advocates showed up and said, hey, if you make it illegal for dozens and dozens of people to sleep in the places that they've found to sleep all these years without providing any kind of alternatives, you're just going to exacerbate problems. And can we have some time to create some real solutions to that problem. And there was no time, no energy, no patience for doing that until, you had dozens of people sleeping in tents on the corner of Lubbock's downtown revitalization project. And then all of a sudden, if you read the articles, and it's in the Disparity Report as well, you had downtown business developers, you had city council members who were personally showing up and saying they cared deeply about resolving this problem. People who frankly previously told us, that's not our problem, that's your problem. When it was on the corner of Broadway and Q, it was, front and center, their issue that they wanted to resolve. And, that's what we've been saying forever is, can we give some attention to real solutions and not just wait till we're reacting to something that we don't like?
Yeah, and let me add one more thing that I think is important, and Chad will pick it up, and then I'm saying too much, but at the time in 2000, as well as 2010, they formed committees. And I was not invited onto that committee. And I'm not an expert, but I had been working with the homeless for 13 years. And I was not on the committee. Chad was not on the committee. They got business people and Chamber of Commerce and lawyers, and they got people that homelessness was a negative issue to them. And I think, that's one of the things they did not seek out the expertise of people who actually were doing the work. And I fear that's still true to this day, that they look to the wrong people to try to find solutions. So,
Andrea, I want to get your thoughts too, especially from kind of the perspective of the Texas balance of state continuum of care. Have you seen a type of curfew ordinance be effective anywhere? Kind of what needs to come with the curfew ordinance, or can anything be done?
Well, I think that, when you start talking about the laws that are put in place to regulate people just living day-to-day lives, and we kind of have a problem, because this is not something that you can really put an ordinance on. This is somebody's living situation. This is somebody's care, it's our ability to care that is on the line. And I think that across the country, not just in Texas, not just in the balance of state, but people have seen that laws around criminalizing homelessness have been ineffective. And in fact, it costs us more even if we're just going to take away the humanity of it all, right? And we're going to say that it's not important to us whether or not we care for people. Even if we're only interested in the bottom line, the taxes, the government needs and the business needs, we are doing ourselves a disservice at the end of the day. We are spending more money because ultimately we're putting people in jails, and jails are not a rehabilitation center. They are not going to ultimately get people to a place of healing and value and community and connection. And that's what I know our goal is at Open Door, but it's also the goal of so many of the agencies that are a part of the Texas Balance of State and that work with THN and other agencies that are doing work for helping those who are experiencing homelessness and poverty in Texas, and specifically in Lubbock. So I think that, it sounds good because it's an immediate solution. And just like what Chad and Jim were just saying, we are a country that likes to have an immediate response. We like to get in there and see something changed immediately. But what we're not thinking about is the long game. We're not thinking about, this is creating another problem that we're not really prepared to fully deal with in the end.
Adam, I also wanted to ask you, I guess, kind of going back to North Overton, we talk a lot about neighborhood revitalization, and there's just, there's a lot of talk about, is that going to happen elsewhere, be it the Guadalupe neighborhood or that type of forced migration? So, how can this kind of neighborhood revitalization occur, without the gentrification and without the forced migration that we're talking about?
Well, I think the big thing, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on this panel. I have just really been enjoying listening to the conversation so far and written down so much about points that I want to jump in on. I think it's important to consult people who live in the neighborhoods whenever you're going to make a decision about what's going to happen with the neighborhood. Everybody has the right to have a voice. We're talking about, Jim, you mentioned that committee that the city appointed, and they put the lawyers and the high-powered people on. Why didn't they put somebody on that committee who is experiencing homelessness? Because that's the person who's going to know what it's like and be able to, people who are experiencing these things know what they need, and their voice needs to be front and center on all this. When we're talking about what happens in Guadalupe, what happens in Parkway Cherry Point, what happens in Chapman Hill, the people that we need to put on whatever committee makes the decision for the neighborhood are the people who are living in the neighborhood, because they're going to be the ones that know what is needed in those neighborhoods. They know, that there's only one bank in the east side of Lubbock. They know, what kind of affordable housing they want, and every decision that the city makes, they need to be front and center. There are certainly a lot of policies that the city can take, maybe community land trust or finding ways to preserve affordable housing. But I think rule number one is whenever you're making a decision involving a population, that population be represented. I also just really wanted to comment on, these curfew ordinances. We've done the same thing. It's a big debate in Austin, where I live right now. We're allowing camping under overpasses, and the governor has actually stepped in to try and stop that. I think, as a country, we'd rather push somebody aside than actually deal with the problem, like y'all are saying. It costs money to house people. It is, if you break down the numbers, it's a lot cheaper to house somebody and give them resources than it is to pay for their emergency room bill, to to deal with somebody in jail or something like that. But, I think a lot of politicians just, they have this idea of what people deserve, and all this morality gets mixed up into it. We might want to, maybe we can touch on that later, but I just think that it's important to, if you see somebody sleeping in a tent, or if you run across somebody that's homeless, you're confronted with that image and you're forced to try and do something. And it's a lot easier for politicians to just say go away than it is to actually try and figure out how to deal with the problem for the long term.
I agree that we have to have a discussion about the humanity and like the morality behind it all as well. Like, you can't separate everything. That this is not just about laws and how things look, but ultimately, if we look at who is being affected, I appreciate that this segment was added to the disparity report as a whole. It does beg the issue that this is about continuing to oppress people who are not in power, who are not in our middle class, who are experiencing poverty, who are people of color, who are people who are disenfranchised, or people with mental illness. So all of these others, the people that we have made as other, and not really digging into the humanity of how we should be treating one another. I know that sounds so kumbaya of me, but it also is good business sense too. So we go, at the end of the day, it makes sense because of what Adam was just saying, and what I was saying earlier about the fact that it costs us more money. And sometimes I want to kind of shake politicians and say, hey, listen, we're trying to help you out too. Because as a person who lives in a neighborhood that I want to be safe, and I want it to look nice, and I want all of those things too, but I want them for you too. I don't just want them for myself. And I think that's where we miss the point. We miss the opportunity to want those things for everybody, and to humanize people and not just make them other. Because when we make them other, then we don't have to deal with it. Then we can put it around the corner. Then that's not my sister, my brother, my cousin. That's that guy over there that did something that made him deserve to be homeless. And no one deserves to be homeless. No, I think that's the key. Like if we could all get that in our minds, that no one deserves, even if we've been through hard times, made bad choices, all the things, we don't deserve hell and damnation, so to speak. I'm a Christian. I believe fully that we all deserve life and life abundantly. And I want to help you get there. I could go on and on, but I'll stop because I'm.
Well, y'all are really nice people, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I do think it's really important because there's probably people on this call watching who are not huge fans of the things that you're talking about. And I hope they're watching. And, you know, it's also true that it's not fair for anyone to live in an environment where their safety and well-being is threatened. People in homelessness, as well as people in housing, people in businesses, people that are walking downtown. You know, you saw in the news today that Lubbock's got plans to put a park downtown, and, you know, comments online are all about, oh, people in homelessness are gonna be in the park, whatever, it's gonna be terrible. I want to be very clear from me and from Open Door for anybody that's kind of a skeptic hearing us. We never argued that we should just ignore all the problems at Mahon Library. We never have argued that we should just ignore all of the problems that are related to homelessness, including people sleeping around businesses and leaving a mess in alleys and things in parks. You know, we totally get that. We hear you. We've heard those complaints forever, and we're not dismissing them. We are simply saying we need solutions rather than, like we've said, just ordinances or just pushing people away. We want people out of parks more than anybody. Like if you're a frustrated businessman, I want you to know we want people out of your area more than you do, because we know these people by name. We care about your business too. We care about all of our communities. We may have some different angles that we come at this, but the real solution that you want and we want, even if we don't always see it clearly, is to get people out of those places of crisis and out of places that really nobody's designed to live in. Nobody was ever designed to live around Mahon Library. And we didn't want that. We're not advocates of people living around Mahon Library. We're advocates of figuring out a way to get them into housing instead of just pushing them to some other place like the woods.
Yeah. And Chad, let me add here too, another piece of the history. If it's, yeah, I'm on another piece of the history that is missed. Behind the scenes back in 2000, I was meeting with the developers' sons. And one of the things that we were trying to encourage was, at the same time, Greenfare, some of the public housing that was off MLK, they had closed large sections of it. And there were a lot of housing there. And we were trying to advocate for the developers to help develop that and allow us to go in with them to create a systemic context, a communal context, where we would be able to do job training and counseling and a lot of the things that Open Door is doing now. That was on the table back in 2000. And, you know, the developer had some pretty high connections as well to the city. And it was totally ignored. There was no consideration whatsoever. We even said, you can make a little money because we're not going to do this for free. They'll pay something. And so that was on the table back in 2000, and it was totally ignored as well.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. So I'm going to get to some of these. What about the homeless that can't be in shelters due to criminal charges? Where are they supposed to stay?
That's a really good question. We see that in Lubbock and in every community. The reality is most places where you stay, including shelters, they have rules and they have policies that they enforce. Sometimes there are more policies than are really necessary. And what experts in homelessness around the country really promote is what's called low barrier shelter. And what that means is we're trying to recognize homelessness as a crisis and put as few barriers in front of people needing that kind of service as possible. So, you probably all heard of barriers like needing an ID in order to stay in a shelter, needing to go to apply for a certain number of jobs every day if you're unemployed. There's any number of requirements that some shelters have. And, at Open Door, a lot of places in Lubbock and in Texas would advocate for shelters to reconsider some of those policies to make sure that people who need that service aren't unnecessarily put out on the streets. That being said, there's almost no place that has zero rules and requirements except for the Lubbock County Jail. And so, it is a really tough thing. On the one hand, you have shelters in places that are trying to take care of the safety of any number of people, and and individuals come in that may have criminal histories that compromise that. So it's a very, very tough thing for communities. That's why I think it's really important to say that our shelters need to be housing focused. And sometimes people in homelessness can bypass shelters, especially if it's not very safe for them to be there or they run into issues there. They can even bypass that and get directly into housing. And we need to do that a lot more.
I think it also speaks to the necessity, Chad, for like diverse group of people collaborating. So that it encourages me that there's a place for people with children to go to. And it encourages me that there's a place for women specifically to go to. There's a place for men to go. So I think that, when we all recognize our strengths, it's one of the things that Open Door tries not to duplicate services that are being done somewhere else. Grace Campus is doing great work. Salvation Army is doing great work, but honoring the great work that's being done in each individual place is the first step. And then being able to say, how can we work together to make sure that we're bringing our best A game for what we do to the table. That way, even the sex offender who can't go to the place where there's kids, even the person who is violent, and even the person who has trauma that hasn't been fully dealt with.
Very nice, thank you. And okay, adding to that, here's another question. What about sex offenders that can't be in shelters? What do they do? I know you kind of just touched on that, but can you kind of elaborate?
Yeah, so that's a great example. There's no rule that says a shelter cannot house a sex offender generally, although there are zoning ordinances and stuff like that in various cities that do prohibit that. And that may be the case in Lubbock. I haven't looked at the zoning for all of our shelters in regards to sex offenders, but that's a great example of how a person who is has a sex offense may not fit in a certain shelter, but that doesn't mean we still can't house them. And there's a lot of community animosity towards people in sex offenses. I'll just say briefly, what would we rather have as a community? Someone who is a sex offender who's just living on the streets, who knows where, or somebody who is in housing? Their ability to have stability in their life actually reduces. There's tons of this. I don't want to go way off on it, but there's studies that have shown that people in housing are less likely to reoffend. And so, it's a hard topic for sure, but bottom line is it's more beneficial for everybody if people have stability in their lives rather than instability for people of all criminal offenses.
And I think, to add to that, we have a certain image in our mind of what a sex offender looks like. And we forget that there are women, children, people who have been victimized, who became sex offenders because of even, their own trafficking experiences and so forth and so on. That causes, so that it's a bigger issue. It's like, we think it's just the creepy guy on the corner, but it's not just the creepy guy on the corner. It's the kid who did something when he was 15 and he's trying to work back from that. And we have to get to the place where we're trying to deal with the actual issues that made them a sex offender, and not just, well, we'll put them in another category, kind of like a leper, and put them over here and never deal with them again.
Very good. Thank y'all. Another question: between the various services, how many people in homelessness can Lubbock currently house?
I'll say just briefly that all of that is in the Lubbock Disparity Report, the chapter on homelessness. There's tons of numbers there. It is a bit complicated because there are beds that are dedicated to certain populations, subpopulations like families only, or women with children only, or single adult beds. And so, when we look at homelessness in Lubbock and in any community, you have to not only look at the total number of people, but the demographics, and then compare that to the kinds of beds that are available in our community. And the largest demographic within Lubbock homelessness are single adults. And so the number of beds that we have available for single adults, I'll just tell you, is less than the total number of single adults that we counted on a single night in January this year. So I use that to say, even if everybody was on their best behavior and every shelter was low barrier, we still would have more people than we have beds available on a typical night.
Another question, I've heard Mayor Dan Pope mention concentrating services in one location. What are your thoughts on that? And I've heard that same thing too. I remember when the most recent committee was meeting, there was a lot of references to San Antonio's Haven for Hope. But I mean, Chad, in the Disparity Report, you kind of mentioned how it's best to kind of desegregate everyone across the city. So what are your thoughts on kind of one main location and not?
We do discuss this in the report a little bit. I will say that I want to be clear that there's no one way to address homelessness, and there's not any one solution to the problem. It's going to take a lot of different kinds of approaches and a lot of different groups collaborating. But I will say that I think most people understand that consolidating a bunch of people in a similar condition in one place is not ideal. We've seen projects where we segregate people of a certain socioeconomic group into one area of town, and it's not always been beneficial. And when people look at homelessness, kind of the best practice is scattered site and integrated housing. That's housing that is integrated into neighborhoods and communities. If we're, we see all the time people saying, well, we've got these empty buildings, we've got these dilapidated old buildings somewhere, let's just renovate it and put everybody in homelessness there. I would say that would be a nightmare. In my experience, people do so much better when they're spread out through a city and spread out through a neighborhood. They're more likely to be around jobs and integrated into regular neighborhoods rather than marginalized in some other area. And I'd love to hear from Adam and Nick on this as well, if you have anything on kind of our tendency to segregate people into certain areas. I mean, we've heard at city council meetings, zoning meetings, people saying, what we really need to do is just move everybody east of town in an industrial area, and that's going to solve the problem. And I have some major problems with that for a number of reasons, but love to hear from you guys too.
Yeah, the first thing I just want to add for those who are listening in, the way that Chad talks about this topic is so outcomes oriented. And the thing that I want to point out is, if we had had this conversation 20 years ago, there would have been a lot of hand wringing around, how do we help these people? Very much so the sort of charitable approach, paternalistic approach to thinking about how can we deal with individuals that are currently experiencing homelessness? What has happened in this period in time is an enormous amount of research, data, best practices, community engagement that has really come to define the appropriate ways in which to tackle this issue. And so both from a what's called an econometric standpoint, so from a city's ledger perspective, implementing policies like Chad has been promoting and executing here in Lubbock are widely considered to be the most cost-effective solutions available to any community that they have, which is truly housing first. And so from a intervention standpoint, from a community development standpoint, there's been a massive paradigm shift nationally in how we think about this issue. One of the challenges that we then experience at the local level here in Lubbock is that sometimes these types of information don't trickle into our community fast enough. And so, especially when it comes to the types of services that we provide, oftentimes, and this is true for a lot of folks, when we do charitable contributions and donations, we have favorites where certain organizations or certain groups that we give to regardless of the types of interventions that they are doing, because we believe in their mission, we believe in their vision. But the thing is, where the rubber hits the road, the actual operations of these organizations matter. And so some of the comments that people have pointed out, there are still some organizations that routinely require drug testing for individuals to be able to stay within their housing units. And again, it completely flies in the face of our understanding of the cycles of relapse and recovery that a typical individual encounters. And so, first by eliminating these barriers and making this sort of a more important aspect to it. And then the other challenge is conceptually, we have to change the way that we think about dealing with a lack of homes. And so, being able to aggregate everyone together, it can functionally work if you have a massive donation. People talk about the San Antonio example. If you build a very, very elaborate, fully holistic center for individuals that has wraparound services, right? If you have sort of massive philanthropic injections, you can achieve something like that. But a far more appropriate approach is what Chad promotes, which is this integration and finding ways to make sure that as a community, we're moving in that direction. Now, one of the big barriers is misinformation to that. So there are voucher programs that HUD allows to be used, Housing and Urban Development, the federal government, to place individuals currently experiencing homelessness into private housing. And HUD effectively pays for the difference in the rental cost of what they can afford and what the landlord is charging. Now, the difficulty with that just simply comes from the fact that there are a lot of landlords in the city of Lubbock that refuse to participate in those types of programs. And so first, what it comes to is they're thinking about, oh, this individual, because they previously have experienced homelessness, they're going to be a terrible tenant. And so I don't want them here. And so why would I want to participate in this voucher program? But the data shows that these individuals as tenants do no worse in terms of damage or liabilities or things like that to the actual property itself as any other tenant potentially would. But it's about changing people's perspectives on these things, finding ways to reach out and to say, please consider participating in these programs because of the fact that there's a lot more that we're leaving on the table as a community. If we were using dollars as a community, all the charitable dollars that we put into homelessness, if we use them as efficiently and as effectively as what Open Door does, we would not have chronic homelessness in Lubbock, period. The challenge becomes the fragmentation, the difficulties in bringing individuals together to have that conversation and making sure that we all have the human perspective, that we don't view these individuals as on a migratory pattern from the East Coast to the West Coast, but we acknowledge that they are currently experiencing homelessness because of the gaps in our safety net in Lubbock, that these are individuals that grew up in our community, are from our community, are a part of our community, and their struggles are our own. So, that to me is kind of how I think about these pieces. So when it comes to concentrating individuals, if you're providing a very, very comprehensive set of services while doing that, fantastic. It's just a very costly model that is very much so out of reach for the vast majority of communities unless there's effectively some kind of major philanthropic donor that's willing to back something like that.
Thanks,
Let
Chad.
me add a little bit. Back in the late 1970s, Ruby Payne's book on understanding poverty was influential to us as it discussed moving away from a purely financial idea of solving the problem of just throwing money at it or throwing food at it or throwing clothes at it. And she developed very well some things that have been principles for Open Door Carpenter's Church from the very beginning, of trying to create community and to give back their humanity. Things like emotional poverty, addressing emotional poverty, addressing support system poverty, addressing role model poverty. And there are 9 different things that Ruby Payne identified. At the time, my coworker then, Brent McKay, and I, we added one extra one onto it, of a poverty of a safe space. That people without safe space, somewhere that is safe for them to be, that all of these other poverties which may influence them that have to be addressed can't be addressed. And so it's interesting 20 years later that Housing First has become that safe space. And forced migration doesn't work. Concentration camps don't work either. And so there's a lot of, once we've got them, we force them into migration, then we try to bring them into concentration camps. Neither one of those are the right solution. And so safe space is something that I think has to be considered in trying to solve part of the problems with homelessness.
So there's a lot of local organizations that aren't represented on this panel, Grace Campus, Salvation Army, Family Promise, Women's Protective Services. Kind of tell me how everyone, because Chad, you kind of make it seem like people, and especially kind of on the South Plains Homeless Consortium, they're kind of not working together. So how can, moving forward, how can people start working together? Because it seems like that's kind of one of the things that needs to be addressed.
I want to give a shout out to a couple people before you answer that, Chad, because I think that even though I think we're all putting our head down trying to do the work, and so it's not necessarily this conscious not working together as much as it is busy and focused on where you're at and what you're doing. Because the folks at Grace Campus, at Salvation Army, at WPS, they're doing great things in their own lane, and I think that that's appropriate, and the conversations that can be had and are continuing to be had, like with the consortium or other groups, are challenging at times, just because we're all so much in our own corners. And I'll turn it back over to you, Chad, but I just want to give a shout out because I know that we've specifically, especially during coronavirus time, have had some really great collaboration, especially with our folks over at Salvation Army. I just can't say that enough, that they've been really helpful in making sure that things keep running and things, that we're all.
Yeah. There are many groups doing great work here in Lubbock. And like I said earlier, it's not any one group or any one solution that's going to resolve this problem. But I do think there's a lot of room for us to improve here in Lubbock. We are I think the 7th largest city in Texas. We are a large mid-sized city in Texas, and yet our systems, not just our homeless system, but especially our system that addresses homelessness, is still lagging behind and functioning more like a small town community where, and I think 2 things, we're needing to catch up in terms of capacity, but the problem is so big and the community is so vast that we end up in silos, not working collaboratively together. Some of our dysfunction has simply been, like Andrea said, it's so hard enough just to focus on what we're trying to handle right in front of us. So many organizations, we have our head down and we're trying to get the job done, and we don't have the time or the energy or capacity to look up and see what's going on in the big picture. And yet, as a community, Lubbock desperately needs that to happen. You look at Abilene, Amarillo, there's some of these other communities that are our size who are doing great work. Denton is another one. And there's some things that are going on there that I think have been kind of central to allowing them to do that. One of them is that they have a local homeless coalition that has a greater investment in its leadership and what they're doing. So the South Plains Homeless Consortium is entirely volunteer based. So what you have is you have people who they're working full time, many of them in their own agencies and organizations, and they're volunteering their extra time to deal with the system-wide issue. Now you take somebody who, they're stressed to the max. I know the work we do at Open Door, it takes everything we've got, and then you ask us to do something else to deal with a community-wide issue and collaborate with somebody else. We've got very little energy, time, and effort to put into that. Abilene has hired people. Denton has hired people through their United Way. Amarillo has people who are dedicated to dealing with the system. Texas Tech's Mental Health Institute, they're finally having somebody that is initiating and convening conversations about mental health for the entire system and bringing these major stakeholders together. Not to say that it didn't happen at all before that, but that's a great example of it, how it takes that kind of dedicated effort to make something on a system really work. And in Lubbock, we've never really had that. It's all volunteer based. We've also had some typical infighting with, competition over funding or attention, and feeling like, your agency's getting the attention and we want the attention. There has definitely been some of our issues have been over debates about what really should be done. And, those are hard conversations, but every community needs to have them. Again, we don't have to all agree on everything. But when we come in and we say, hey, let's evaluate what we're doing, and we're finding that we're duplicating services, and we're finding that we're spinning our wheels in homelessness, in kind of old models, and how do we improve that? You're inevitably going to step on each other's toes in those conversations. And the challenge is to move beyond the difficulty of those conversations into figuring out how we can all improve what we're doing and work together for the greater good of ending homelessness in our community. So, there's more in the report about that. I'm not here to knock anybody. And I know, sometimes it doesn't feel that way in the hard conversations we have. But we have to get beyond ourselves and start working collaboratively. And I think beyond just those people working in homelessness, Lubbock has to begin thinking about all of our sectors playing a part. This is not just an issue for faith-based nonprofits, like a lot of people want to believe. Police are inevitably involved in homelessness. And thank God we have, the police department's homeless outreach team that has stepped up and realized, hey, they do have a part to play and they can be constructive partners in that work. Healthcare systems, city leadership, it takes a wide variety of people and groups to address this issue, because homelessness does impact almost every social, all of social life and all of public life is impacted by homelessness. And so it takes all of us to play our part.
It's also a state and federal issue too, though. I mean, you talk about fighting over scarce resources, and in the report you do a masterful job of talking about how funding from HUD to finance affordable housing in Lubbock has dried up over time, and the wait list for things like housing choice vouchers is very long. It's closed right now, so people aren't able to get those housing choice vouchers. I mean, it's for across Texas, for every, a lot of people who are making extremely low incomes, very low incomes, folks making minimum wage jobs, they're paying more than 30% of their income, sometimes 50% of their income on rent. So once you get to that point, you have to think about, okay, am I going to pay rent this month? Am I going to buy medicine? Am I going to get food for my child? You have to start making these difficult decisions, and there's not enough money coming in to help these people pay the rent because the government is failing at every level. We need to start, as Texans, as Americans, thinking about asking our government, which we are part of, to start financing these solutions. Because as we've said, a pound of prevention or an ounce of prevention, paying $1 to house somebody is worth a pound of cure on the other end. So I think that's important too. The legislative session is about to come up. Call your state legislature and say, we need more money for funding these housing programs. We call up Jody Arrington, your congressman, say, we need you to start funding HUD. We need you to start funding these affordable housing programs. This isn't a partisan issue. This is a people issue. So I think it's important to, Lubbock isn't the only, every city in Texas has a housing crisis like this. And so it's time we start treating it as a statewide, as a nationwide issue.
Adam, there's kind of a looming eviction crisis, I think, coming up. Can you talk a bit about that and maybe what can be done to, if anything, kind of prevent that?
Well, there are two things. One, the CDC moratorium, the Centers for Disease Control, has stopped evictions related to COVID until December 30th. And we're looking at that date and thinking, oh my God, there's a cliff there. We don't know what's going to happen. One thing that could happen, and we're asking the governor and the Supreme Court of Texas to do this, is to continue the moratorium. The governor has put an eviction diversion program in place. It's a pilot project right now. They're about to make that statewide. So far, the state's only allocated $40 million. That's not a lot of money when you look at the scope of what we're seeing out there. But the first things first is continue the moratorium past the 30th, because we're still in this pandemic, we're still in crisis. Number two, provide billions of dollars from the federal level, a lot of money from the state level to pay for rental relief. And this is, there aren't a lot of times where housing advocates agree with the landlords. This is one time where we agree with it, because landlords are operating a business right now. They don't profit when they evict people. It's better for them, for folks to stay housed. So the federal government, the state government needs to be providing people who have lost their jobs, who have faced hard times during this pandemic, with rental relief so they can stay in their homes until we get to the other side of this thing. And I can post a petition that Texas Housers has written in the chat if y'all would like to sign on. I don't know if that's kosher, but just some shameless promotion for what we're doing, and it's important work. So I appreciate the question.
Excellent. Yes, sir. Thank you. Before we moved on, Quinn, I kind of wanted to ask you a question about humanizing individuals experiencing homelessness. In Chad's report, he says, perhaps the most fundamental recommendation of this section of the report is a call to humanize the thoughts and words regarding people experiencing homelessness. Kind of talk about your experience, and do you feel like there's kind of this misconception about people in homelessness?
Yeah, trying to think what you're telling me there, asking me. A lot of people, when they know that on the streets, they're, they feel like human beings, but, in this situation, being on the street so long in places and things that you go through day by day, and the stress and stuff, that you don't feel like a human being until you can get a place that used to be a home. I know a lot of people that had homes like myself in Brownfield and Dallas and places. You just feel more human when you got a place and you're taking better care of yourself. Because out on the streets and it's hard to take care of yourself. It's hard to function right, how to think right, how to do things for yourself, and wonder your safety at night time. And I've seen a lot of things, through my years and places, and it's hard. I mean, but being in a home, you feel so much human. I mean, you feel comfortable, you feel better, you feel about yourself, your esteem. I mean, it feels good. I mean, it's just being a human being. You know, people that care. You know.
Quinn, we've been talking a lot about the housing first model, and it seems like all the panelists are in support and advocating for the housing first model. Can you talk about your experience with that and how that was different than, say, a shelter and kind of short stays?
Well, I felt a lot better when I got moved in my house 4 years ago. I felt so much better, safety, and can eat what I want to eat, and don't have to worry about someone telling me what to do this, and people that's out there on the streets and trying to take what you need, guys, and everything, because they steal from you and things and start going through all kinds of things like that. I mean, you feel so much secure and sleep better and have a peace of mind, and then always anxious for tomorrow. Get ready. I mean, because I'm always looking forward to tomorrow.
Very good. Excellent.
Let me jump in real quick, if I may. Jim and I have known Quinn for a long time. He was at Open Door when it was Carpenter's Church, when it was Carpenter's Kitchen, before Carpenter's Church even existed 23 years ago. And I'll say this because I love you, Quinn, and not as any insult at all, but those years that you were in homelessness, there were a lot of people, including some providers here in town, who thought he's never going to change. He's never going to be able to get it off the streets. The services that are available to him, he's never going to take advantage of it. There are people on the streets who've been, especially people who've been on the streets for a long, long time, that even providers get in their minds that, well, they're a lost cause. They're the hard to house. They're not housing ready. And 4 years ago, from your campsite in North Overton, he moved directly from his tent into an apartment, and he's been there ever since. And he's on a standard lease, just like any other renter in Lubbock. He's not in shelter. It's not just a handout. He has ownership of his space and what he's doing there. And he's a great example of how Housing First works. And, people who you think are never gonna make it, they can make it. And he's a great example of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes back to that whole concept, Chad and Quinn, about that we live in a society that wants to be a society and have results that come really quickly and that look the way that we think they should look. But when we approach how we're dealing with homelessness or poverty the same way we approach everything else, which is that we all have choice. We have personal choice in how we make progress or don't make progress in our own lives. And nobody is policing my decision to eat an extra chocolate bar, but they might be policing somebody else's decision to do something that may not be as healthy for them. I simplify it in that way, but ultimately we're in our humanness, we want to be able to make choices for ourselves. We want to be able to not be told when we have to do things or what we have to eat or all of those things. And so I think that ultimately this again goes back to that when we stop just coming to the bottom line, we actually think about the people and we remember that they are us and we are them, and it's not other, then we make a different decision about how we deal with them.
So help me understand what needs to be done and what's coming next in terms of downtown. There's just there's a lot of minds at play, and business owners are complaining about people in homelessness, and the city wants downtown revitalization to occur, and they don't really know how to move forward other than the only kind of solutions that have been proposed are stricter enforcement on the curfew, and then panhandlers, stricter enforcement. So kind of what's all yours I mean, what's the idea and how Lubbock kind of moves forward? And, of course, it's going to take money. Where does the money come from?
Well, somebody said it in one of the chat or the questions that there's a lot of money out there. We are, as Chad was saying, this is a mid-sized town, a small mid-sized city, right? And so there's people out there, but it's how we choose to spend our money. And I am not opposed to having a really cute downtown where I can go sip lattes and do all the fun things that you do when you're, that you can do. I want a town that's vibrant and growing and doing great things. I want to live somewhere that somebody wants to come and play a concert that I'm interested in listening to, all those things. So we understand. I don't think that it has to be one or the other. And I think that's the challenge, is that so many people think, well, if I'm on the side of business, then I must be against supporting those who need help. And it doesn't have to be that way. That when we think about things collaboratively, and when we take the position that my business is also tied to somebody's self, that they're to their whole being, that we can do these. I wouldn't want somebody, like Chad said earlier, I wouldn't want somebody on the stoop at my business or anything like that. And as a person who works within this community and for Open Door, that's not what we want either. We want that to end. Collaboration, and we can't say that enough. It's one of the things that we talk about a lot when we're talking about the Texas Balance of State and with THN, with our homeless network across the state. It's about collaboration, taking the time to look up from what you're doing and saying, how can we fill in our part across the board, and not just for our grant or for our money or for our donors or for our base or for whatever, but how can we do stuff together? The money is there. This is not a poor area, by any stretch of the imagination. And anybody who's lived in places where you see things that are worse than this, you understand that this is not a poor area. We have so many resources, not just financial, but people resources, super smart folks. We have universities in this area with people who are thinking folks, smarter than me, doing great things. And so if we would just be willing to use those resources here and not let them sort of, come learn and leave, but we really incentivize people to stay and build and invest, then I think you might see some things differently.
Yeah, and I think, when it comes to policies, there's a lot that could be done. I think on one level, just simply decriminalizing people currently experiencing homelessness, right? So we have as aggressive anti-loitering laws as you possibly can have as a community. The task force that was put together, the most recent one, their recommendations were to go even farther. But actually they had to get rid of those recommendations because the day that they were going to submit them, the Supreme Court ruling had come down in Washington, I believe, around the fact that cities cannot overregulate this issue unless they can show that they have sufficient capacity on a daily basis to house individuals who are currently on the streets. So on one level, we need to stop these individuals from having to access our criminal justice system. It's incredibly expensive, and it's something that the city has the ability to aggressively move on. I think the other honestly comes more from a policy stance, that the city of Lubbock and its city council adopt a resolution wholeheartedly embracing housing first as the city's definitive strategy for tackling this issue. I know that seems odd that such a symbolic thing matters, but there's a lot of aspects to this. When it comes to community development dollars and how those are allocated across the continuum of care, the policies that the city of Lubbock sets have an impact on shaping how these various community groups are responding. And you can create incentives to have them move in the right direction. This is something that we absolutely need to do. I mentioned this earlier. We have a lot of legacy. We have really great longstanding charitable organizations in Lubbock that do great work, but unfortunately their models of operation have not evolved with the changing times and understanding of best practices and how to tackle this issue. And so a lot of this is about having people understand that housing first is a best practice, that it is widely regarded nationally as the preeminent strategy for dealing with this, both from a human rights standpoint and an econometric standpoint when it comes to the city's own budget. What's the most cost-effective way of dealing with this? And so a lot of this is just getting the word out. There are individuals, I'm sure, that are listening to this conversation that know individuals on the boards of various nonprofits and charitable groups that are involved in this topic, and reaching out to them and making sure that they have an understanding. Hey, are you current with how the thinking is around this topic? Have you brought that up in a board conversation? Have you talked to an executive director? Have you started to ask them, what is your approach to housing first? And so that, to me, really, from a symbolic standpoint, the city essentially planting its flag and saying that this officially is our agenda. And this is something that other communities have done, because what you're doing is you're showing leadership. You're sending signals to community members and to community groups that we need to start to move in this direction. And our operations, our legacy operations, the way in which that we provide care, provide services, need to change, need to adapt as we have a better understanding of how to tackle these issues. So those to me would probably be two sort of big ones. One that I think could be done through resolution. The other one would obviously take a much larger conversation in terms of reforming ordinances.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
Let me just say real quick, very briefly, the solution to homelessness, we believe, is a home. And there's many things that play a part in it, but the end goal always for someone who is homeless is to get to a home. And so our whole system needs to have a housing orientation and figure out how to direct people towards sustainable housing. It involves every step of the way, including affordable and fair housing to prevent people from entering into homelessness. And I talk about this in the report just a little bit, but in greater detail, but there are resources that are left on the table every year. So we're not maximizing what's available to us already in Lubbock. And I think there's some ways that we could use what we are receiving already more efficiently to do more. So, I've got the slides, but it'll take too long to pull them up. But I'll just mention Abilene again. If you've heard them in the news recently, just last month, they announced that they reached functional zero for chronic homelessness, which basically means that over a period of time, they've been able to show that based on the number of people who enter their system and exit their system and exist in their system at any given time in chronic homelessness, they have enough resources to house them continually. And so they're one of only a few cities in the entire country that have reached functional zero with veteran homelessness and chronic homelessness. So I say it is possible. And one of our cities just down the road has done this. Lubbock can totally do this. It is within the realm of possibility. In a very short period of time, I think within the next year or two, we could reach functional zero in both of those groups and then keep moving and try to end homelessness for every subpopulation. So it can be done. There are ways to do it. We just have to have the will to move in that direction.
Yeah. Let me go ahead.
No, please, Jim.
I was just going to tack on to what Chad was saying. I think Lubbock could be a leader in this, because of the good organizations that we have. There is this collaboration of major organizations, major wisdom, major experience, major knowledge. What's missing, in my opinion, and this is coming from 20 years plus dealing with this in Lubbock, is we've heard the saying, give a man to fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. But you have to ask the question, well, who controls the fish pond? Who controls the fish pond? And the city controls the fish pond. They control the neighborhoods. They control the ordinances. And the thing that we have not had in Lubbock that I think Abilene has and Amarillo has and Denton has is buy-in by the city of Lubbock, from the city council, from the mayor down. Yeah, and that's what I hope people will advocate for. that the city will just simply sit down with the people who have understanding of this and work together. Because we can do all the training and teaching we want, but until the owner of the fish pond allows equity in how everybody has access to that fish pond, we will continue to have the disparities across the board that we see in Lubbock, Texas. And so I hope we will advocate to the city, especially people who may be listening who have friends on the city council and influence. Please talk to them. Please encourage them to reach out to Open Door and some of these other organizations to create a context to sit and talk.
And Matt, I was just going to add one thing that it's pretty quick, that there's a gap. One of the things I noticed when I moved here a couple of years ago, that is pretty evident to a lot of us who are doing this work, is that there's a gap in services here that exists around mental health. And so when we kind of invest in that as well, not specifically for just providers, but I think that when we say we're going to train our council members, our government leaders, our police officers in trauma-informed care, then we change the lens with which they look at how to help someone who is experiencing or who has experienced great trauma in their life. And so that's one gap that we can sort of activate and find ways to put some resources towards and put some support behind. If people are looking to know more about trauma-informed care, you can look at it online, and there's lots and lots out there. But I think when you have a city, you have a mayor like Anthony Williams who is bought in, it's because he's coming from a perspective that is fully, it's informed on all sides of the matter, and not just about the financial ramifications of someone being homeless, but about the reasons why and how they got to that place.
Absolutely. A few more questions people have submitted. What are the best ways to recruit others to become involved in this effort, financially or otherwise? I don't know who wants to take that question.
I think make checks out to Quinn Paschal and I'm just kidding. This is a panel that's hosted by Open Door, but I don't want to just push support for our organization. There are many organizations in town that are doing great work, and we always promote looking into what they're doing, talking to the people who are on the ground, who know what's going on, and find out from them what's really needed. So a lot of times we just kind of come up in our own heads like, oh, homeless people down at the park, they need food, so I'm gonna make a bunch of sandwiches and go down there. Don't take matters into your own hand like that. Just, call somebody, go on their website, go on their Facebook page and find out what the needs really are and help get involved that way.
Very good, thank you. There was a question and now I can't find it. It was about, what cities are doing it right. And, we've mentioned Abilene. So help me understand what they're doing differently in Abilene and how we can kind of mimic that, how Lubbock can mimic that.
Okay, well, I'll give a quick little plug for an organization called Community Solutions, and they have a campaign called Built for Zero. You can go online and find that. If somebody's on the panel is, pulling up websites, put that in the chat box. They have basically come into Abilene, and they, all the work is done on the ground. The community, the advocates, providers in Abilene are doing the work. But basically they get together and they do what's called a by name list. And they have, like Andrea said, from the mayor down to all the participants in the programs, they have committed themselves to the goal of ending veteran homelessness and then chronic homelessness. And what they do is they have a list, just like we do in Lubbock, of every person who has shown up in the system that meets that criteria. And they go down the list name by name and they say, what are we going to do to house Joe? Okay, now that we got Joe housed, what are we going to do to house Kathy? And they literally went down the list name by name until they housed every veteran. And, you know, they literally went down the list and named every person in chronic homelessness and housed them. And we are working on that in Lubbock. We're a little bit behind where they are. But I think that's something that we can do here as well. I know they're doing it in a number of cities. And then, you know, they're finding the resources to get that done. Amarillo is a great example. They took advantage of what's called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and they applied for mainstream vouchers last year, and they got 125, I think it was 125, 150 of these vouchers that most people know as Section 8 vouchers that subsidize the cost of housing for people. And they have used those to help get people out of homelessness into housing. We can totally do that in our community. I think we got 25 here in Lubbock at the end of last year. There's more available that we just need to ask for, and then we can use those to house people just like they are. So again, lots of ways to do it. Just getting the people together and dedicating ourselves to getting it done.
Very good. So we're approaching 8 o'clock here. I think I'm going to open the floor. Does anybody have any final thoughts? Anything you want to get off your chest that we haven't discussed this evening?
I'd love to hear final thoughts as well, but I'll just say if there are questions that have been asked that we haven't gotten to, I know there are probably a few. We'll try to respond on our Facebook page tomorrow or whatever, kind of a written response to any of those.
I just want to thank everybody for being here and Matt, for you helping us to facilitate this conversation. I think that ultimately, if we keep talking, that's the first step. It's not the only step, but it's definitely the first step. If we keep talking, and then if we keep listening, and then if we keep acting. So in the order, you know, not just listening and hearing, taking it and doing something with it, finding that place, that thing that is passionate to you. Like Chad said earlier, there's so many people doing great work. Find one that's doing something that you can get behind and really dig in.
I'd like to say too, we've come so far. We really have. You know, when Quinn and I can look back to a time when, yeah, there was very little that was actually happening that was substantive for long term. And Lubbock has come so far, but we haven't arrived yet. And yet we have all the pieces. We have all the pieces to finish the task. It's just, we got to bring those pieces together. And so I'm hopeful. I'm as hopeful now as I have ever been. And so I want to thank everybody on this panel and people that are listening as well. Be hopeful.
And I'll build off of Jim's point. The answers that we need, the solutions that we need, the capacities that we need, we have. You know, and I think that to me is where we need to have this understanding that we have people on the ground that can execute. We have an understanding of how to move forward. We have the infrastructure to do so, but it really is about getting out the word. It is making sure that we are able to humanize this topic, that we combat a lot of the myths that Lubbock citizens have about people currently experiencing homelessness in our community, and that we continue to advocate both to those who we know in the nonprofit and charitable community space in Lubbock, but then to also our city council members, getting them and encouraging them to adopt a housing first policy strategy for the city of Lubbock. I think to me is one of the first steps that we could do on the city level to acknowledge and show that this is the way forward. You know, we need to have the ability for everyone to move in the same direction. And if we can do that, this problem can be solved. It really is about interpersonal relationships and getting stakeholders to agree and to align on how we tackle it is really the challenge that we currently are faced with today.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, very good. Thank you so much to our panel members. Thank you for everyone for listening. And I think that wraps it up. Everyone have a happy holidays.
Thank you.
Happy holidays to everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
y'all.